60 years ago, almost to the day, a home in Murray Hill exploded. The blast knocked the house off of its foundation and it blew the refrigerator through the roof, but it largely failed to register in Jacksonville's collective memory. My guests today hope to change that. I'm joined now by Hal Jacobs, producer and director of a new film about the racist attack called Just Another Bombing. Welcome, Hal.
Welcome. Thank you.
And author and English professor Tim Gilmore, who first wrote about the incident on his blog, JaxPsychoGeo. Hey, Tim.
Hey, and thanks for having us.
Thanks for being here. Tim, start us off, if you will. Remind us of what happened on February 16th, 1964, and why it happened.
Well, sometime in the middle of the night, there is an explosion in Murray Hill Heights, and incredibly, no one was killed in this explosion that blew half of the house off, as you said, blew the refrigerator through the roof, broke windows out in surrounding houses. And it happened because a 6-year-old boy, Donald Godfrey, had begun attending the elementary school around the corner. Donald Godfrey was the first black child at Lackawanna Elementary School, which, if people don't know the name, if they travel on I-10 West in Jacksonville, they've seen the building. It's now used as storage, but he was the first black child at Lackawanna Elementary, and his mother Iona had decided that it's been almost a decade since the Supreme Court said schools are supposed to desegregate, so it's about time Duval County honored that. And the result was the attempted murder of a 6-year-old boy and his mother and other members of their family. And unbelievably, fortunately, they were all on the other side of the house, and none of them died in this bombing.
This house in Murray Hill, as you say, 3259 Gilmore Street. It's at
Yes.
the corner of Gilmore Street and Owen. And there's not a house there any longer.
There's a new house there now.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
Yeah, but for quite a long time, it was abandoned, right?
Okay.
And empty, right?
And so this bombing was deliberate. It was because he had integrated the school, and it was conducted by the Klan.
Right. Since he had started the school earlier in the school year, there had been a number of white parents, and not just parents, but other white supremacist community members too, that regularly harassed Donald and some of his, in particular, a friend he made that was a little white girl that he would walk to school and back with, did all of the obligatory, despicable stuff, spewing the N-word, everything else. The family would get death threats on the phone at home, and so it was clear what the intention was, and I'm sure in a bit we'll also talk about what happened in court afterwards, which was another crime in and of itself, I think.
Hal Jacobs, you begin your film with a note from the filmmaker. Tell us about what's in that note, because it explains how you came to this film, and it's kind of shocking.
Well, I started the film because I lived 4 streets over from Donald. I'm a month younger than Donald. We both started school when we were 6. Now, I lived in that neighborhood for 18 years and never heard a word of this bombing that was 4 streets over from where I live. I had friends who lived a block over from Donald. It was a very black-white neighborhood, very segregated. Donald and I never met. I attended a different school. So I did not find out about it until I read Tim's article basically 3 years ago. And it was 2 years ago that I called Donald and started talking to him. And my first question was, why didn't I know about this? And that was sort of the question that led me through the whole making of the film is, why didn't I know about it? Why don't white people know about this? And I think the film sort of addresses that in kind of a nuanced way, but it tells the story of what they went through on a very personal level. And these aren't major figures of civil rights history. These are ordinary people who did what they thought was right, and made extreme sacrifices, and and dealt with a lot of pain.
Hal, you asked Donald and Iona, his mother, about the response to the bombing when it happened. Let's hear how they remembered it.
Those kinds of things were happening everywhere. And it was a special thing to us because it happened to us, but it wasn't a special thing. It was happening everywhere.
It wasn't a special thing. Man, that's something.
After the bombing, did anybody from the school reach out to you?
Nah.
These were Klan people. They weren't going to reach out to me.
Who's going to reach out to her? Everybody there was white.
They didn't want you here. What are you going to reach out to me for?
Yeah, you ain't supposed to be here anyway.
Nobody from the city, nobody.
City never said a word.
That's the
It was
norm.
normal. And you didn't expect for them to.
Hal, the story isn't widely known today, but even at the time, it didn't seem like it got the proper attention. I would talk about that. What did Iona tell you about police fire response that night?
She doesn't remember talking or seeing any police or fire. Now, I've gone back and looked at articles in the paper, and several of the reporters mention her and mention the family. And remember, she's a 24-year-old domestic worker at the time. Her mother and her aunt owned the house. It's possible that there was so much confusion around that time that, and this is 60 years later, we're dealing with memories. We're dealing with the emotional repercussions of how she looks back on that event. But she remembers Walter Cronkite mentioning it on the CBS Evening News, and he doesn't go into any detail about it. And she ends up writing him a kind of a letter about you only say what you want to say. You don't really talk about what really happened and how it affected all of us. So, yeah, I went back into the archives, newspapers, and the Times Union, the leading paper of the day, did not cover it on their front page. It was sort of buried. The Journal covered it in the next afternoon. But then there was no more coverage, basically, until the trial began, after the FBI conducted a very thorough investigation.
We're talking about a new documentary film recounting the 1964 attack on a Jacksonville 6-year-old who dared to integrate Lackawanna Elementary School. You can join our conversation by calling 904-549-2937, or you can email us your comments at firstcoastconnect@wjct.org. You can also message us on Facebook, Instagram, or tag us on X. I think it would surprise a lot of people, Tim, that this wasn't front page news, an exploding house, a retaliatory attack by the Klan on a 6-year-old. But you've done a lot of reporting like this in your time in Jacksonville, and maybe this doesn't stand out as so unusual.
It doesn't surprise me that it wasn't reported in a more responsible way. It doesn't surprise me that the community did not respond in a responsible and compassionate way. I've been thinking about how incredibly brave it is that Donald and Iona are here this week, and coming back to the source of this trauma and this lifelong trauma for Donald. And thinking about how long it took for Jacksonville to acknowledge that Axe Handle Saturday happened. Our current mayor was the first mayor to ever attend any of the commemorations of Axe Handle Saturday. And yet, when we take down a Confederate monument, we get tons of people saying, tons of particular kinds of white people saying, you can't erase history. But where are those people today? 60 years later, where are those people when we're talking about these kinds of stories? They're completely absent. And so Jacksonville is a different Jacksonville than it was in 1964, but it still has never acknowledged what happened to Donald and Iona. And, I hope that, Hal's making this film, and Donald and Iona's gracious return to Jacksonville this week can serve as some kind of truth and reconciliation, because I think that is really what has long been lacking. And until we are honest with ourselves, we can't have any kind of progress.
We should mention, and we'll get to the details of it later, but Donald and Iona are in town this week because there's going to be 3 screenings of Hal's film locally at 3 different locations, and we'll provide some of that information a little later in the program. Hal, what would be an appropriate recognition of this incident in your mind, or have you talked to Hal and to Danelle and Iona about that?
We haven't really talked about that. I mean, they talk about how they take things one day at a time. I think we sort of are too. The screenings are a start here, and the mayor's office is sending a couple of representatives to the screening Wednesday night. I think the thing is to get it into the classrooms, to get it into the minds and hearts of young people. And I know Florida has passed laws that may ban this kind of content from entering the classroom. So I think that's what we would like to see. Iona was a teacher for 20 years, early childhood teacher. She would love for this to reach young students.
You actually have a disclaimer, maybe a little tongue-in-cheek, or maybe just a recognition of the current realities at the top of the film, warning educators that this film might violate a 2023 law approved by Florida lawmakers. Talk about that.
We wanted to make the film as relevant as possible to younger people. I think by opening that statement, we're also making them aware that they're not learning certain things. Certain things are being banned from discussions in classrooms now, and I think we need to keep raising that point again and again until that thing is abolished. And in the film, we showed bombings that have occurred over the years that kind of echo Iona's point. It was just another bombing. And then we lead up to shootings, mass shootings in the last decade, including the one in Jacksonville last summer. So we keep bringing these points back up that things have not really changed. We are still dealing with the same sort of critical issues and racial hatred that we were dealing with 60 years ago when they planted 20 sticks of dynamite under this house, which was 6 months after the 16th Street bombing in Birmingham that killed the 4 young girls. And they used 10 to 20 sticks of dynamite. So we're talking about, we see the Klan talking about they wanted to send a message, but they were doing more than just sending a message of trying to knock him out of that school. They were trying to wipe out a family, and it's a miracle that they survived.
Just for clarity, that law that's in place now prevents educators from lessons that make white students or a student from feeling discomfort, particularly around issues of race. And you say in your film, this will make people uncomfortable for good reason, Tim. But to Hal's point, there was a lot going on at that time. There was racial violence in St. Augustine that was extremely intense around the same period. There was another bombing that happened in Mims that killed 2 civil rights leaders, Harriet and Henry T. Moore. Mm-hmm. And so this was, in some ways, it was another bombing. It was one of many. Yeah,
I teach writing at FSCJ, and so this last year there has been much angst and discussion about these new Florida laws. I should say that I don't know any educators who have backed down from being honest and teaching the facts about history. And Florida's history is, it's pretty brutal. 1920s is an enormous time for Klan activity. The 1960s, in response to civil rights measures, as you mentioned, what's now known as the St. Augustine movement. And Martin Luther King is in St. Augustine, place where he's staying in St. Augustine is bombed. There's all kinds of violence and brutal, large scale violence in St. Augustine at the time.
Officially sanctioned, the people
absolutely.
deputized to be.
Absolutely, yeah. In Jacksonville, 64 is also I mean, there's the whole 60s are really a bloody decade. We know about Axe Handle Saturday. We need to know about Donald and Iona's story. We know about Johnny Mae Chappelle's murder, really, only because, her son Shelton, who was a few months old at the time, and this is when four white supremacists drove around town looking for, essentially looking for a black person to kill during a period of racial strife in Jacksonville. And they found Johnny Mae Chappelle and they shot her. And her son Shelton was a few months old at the time. He has all his life, 60 years, 60 something years, kept this story alive, asked for answers, asked for some kind of proper response. His situation, or Johnny Mae Chappelle's situation, was another situation where, the outcome in court was similar to, as I'm sure, again, I keep alluding to. I'm sure we'll talk about in a minute.
Let's talk about
Yeah,
that a little
okay.
bit. I mean, so they did fairly quickly resolve the case. They found a man, a Klansman who just moved here from Indiana. He confessed to the crime. He implicated 5 accomplices, and he was punished. He went to trial.
So the only person who served any kind of time was the person who came forward and basically ratted out the other Klansmen, right? There was the first trial, there was an acquittal of one Klansman, and there was a mistrial for the others. The second trial, they were all acquitted. The attorney was J.B. Stoner, who was a notorious person. He would, a few years later, he would be the person who defended the murder of Martin Luther King. He was also involved in some of the bombings in Birmingham, Alabama. We found out, in the early 1980s. He was the attorney in court. He was successful in defending them in court. He referred to it as a victory for the white race.
And it was an all-white jury
Right.
that acquitted these 5 men.
Yes.
Hal, we had talked about having Danelle and Iona on the show today. They still have some concerns about safety. Danelle has moved out of the country.
Right. He's now living in Ghana after extensive travel in the State Department. He was moving around quite a bit and decided that Ghana was the place for him and his wife to, start over, build a home. Iona's in Washington, D.C. Yeah, Jacksonville was the site of a lot of trauma. They still have family and friends here, but I think it took a lot for them to decide to come and also tell this story at this time, knowing that the shape this country is in right now, everything being so polarized and guns being everywhere. It's a worry.
Was it difficult to persuade them to participate in your documentary?
No, that's what's surprising to me, that they were so open from the beginning. I think we had this bond. I lived in the neighborhood. We were able to talk about, Donald and I were able to talk about growing up in that neighborhood. Donald had written a book about his childhood, and I had read that book. And so he had already been processing a lot of these thoughts. And I'll tell you, trying to compare notes about growing up, it changed my view of the neighborhood. It was no longer this place where I just was free to play baseball in the park, knowing that he wasn't free to go play baseball. I could go up to the, what's the ice cream shop there?
Dreamet.
Yeah, I could go to the Dreamet on my bike, but he couldn't do that. That was Klan country to him. So this has really changed my perspective. And I think that's important. I think as white people, we need to go back and look at the days, the good old days, and think about, well, maybe it wasn't so good for everybody.
That is sort of the discomfort or dissonance that is actually specifically outlawed, though, in the teaching of Florida history.
Exactly.
We've got a comment from Lisa on Facebook. She says, I'm glad to hear about this documentary. In St. Augustine around the same time, Fullerwood Elementary School had the home of a black family, family's home set on fire, and another black family's car was set on fire because they had children that had begun attending the school. There are too many stories that never saw the light of day or were denied because they were hushed up by the white community. and local black people lived in terror. This was the intention of Confederate monuments, to send exactly this kind of message to black people of white supremacy, to make black people stay in their place. Tim, this story, I think, really owes a great debt of gratitude to you for uncovering it, reporting on it in the first place. How did you learn about it?
Well, I don't want to take. I think the person who really needs a lot of credit here is Donald Godfrey. I honestly, I am always digging into one story and finding that it has tendrils into 100 other stories. And I remember thinking that, looking around and seeing that this is something that happened. I mean, a 6-year-old's house is bombed, and yet Jacksonville didn't seem to know that it had happened. And when I reached out to Donald Godfrey, I think this is like 8 years ago now that I first wrote about it. He, at the time, I think he's in Monrovia, and I reached out to him over Facebook. Had no idea if this guy would respond to me or not. He was incredibly gracious to me, and he wants this story to be told. It's incredible courage, and I hope that this community makes him feel rewarded for sharing his story with us.
There's something in the timing about this incident, Hal, that is so shocking about how it occurred. Let's listen to that part of the interview.
Before the bombing, it was Valentine's Day. And they had given him Valentine cards out of his class.
Oh, yeah. We put out Valentine cards. First grade, and that's my first time ever getting a Valentine's.
And the next thing we knew, they were blowing up the house.
A little hard to hear what she says at the end. She says, the next thing we knew, they were blowing up the house. And this really did happen the day after Valentine's Day.
Yeah. And I think that illustrates something. I think people are going to be surprised that there's actually humor and laughs in their telling of the story. And I think that's important. They have such warmth. There's a glow and a humanity about them. And you think about, well, that could have all just been lost if the bomb is 10 feet over. But I think people will be surprised by that. We're telling a story that's sad and certainly tragic, but we're also bringing a lot of life and humanity to it, I think.
I think people would be surprised, as is recounted in the documentary, Tim, that the school never reached out to this kid.
Yeah. Things happened so quickly in this time period too. He as Donald writes about in his book, he attends a different school after this, but he comes back to Lackawanna before he's finished with elementary school. He's a school patrol at that time.
The school at that point is more fully integrated.
It's about to be. Desegregation attempts in Duval County are about to take place, but I don't think they really have yet at that point. I'm sure if people are interested in exact timing of that, Donald can talk about that. At the events this week. I don't think that there was. I don't think that there was ever any attempt to acknowledge on the part of the larger community that it happened. It was almost like if we just ignore it, it didn't really happen. If we don't talk about it, we don't give it any importance, as though it didn't have any importance otherwise.
I think also in the age before social media, there wasn't a way to share this. And there wasn't a sense that you should share it. It's something that you should talk about and be transparent about. And I think that's what will shock young people today, thinking about, well, it was silent. Nobody ever talked about it after it happened. And that sort of thing happened in the majority of black families. If you went back far enough, you would find an act of racial violence like that, and people would not talk about it.
Although you do point out that the black newspapers at the time, including the Florida Star, this was front page news for them.
That's true. Yeah, the black newspapers throughout the country actually covered it pretty well. Yeah.
And the trial was also covered by the New York Times, so it was a case that got national attention, even if it wasn't getting much local attention.
Right, right. And this is 1964, and they're debating the Civil Rights Act in Congress. They passed that in the summer. They actually passed it like a couple of days after the first trial. Where people are, it's declared a mistrial. So things are in the air at that point. And we got to admit, the FBI poured a lot of time and work into breaking up this whole Klan circuit, and especially in Jacksonville, where it was very strong. They went out and investigated 50 to 100 people. They went into their businesses, they went to their homes. I think they really just scared a lot of Klansmen at that time who weren't used to the feds coming down on them. And they had a lot of dynamite on hand. They were already planning at least 2 other bombings before they, caught Rosencrantz in St. Augustine.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh, we've got a call, actually. Sally from St. Augustine. Good morning, Sally. Welcome to First Coast Connect.
Good morning, and thanks for taking the call. I just want to thank the filmmakers for bringing this story to light. It's so important, especially now more than ever, to hear about, these kinds of atrocious acts. And, there are so many thoughts that come to mind hearing this story and all the multiple parts of it. I hear you saying that Donald, he was the one that integrated the school, as if a 6-year-old had any real choice. His family made the decision to allow him to do that. But the fact that this child was targeted by the same types of people who now claim that, we have to protect our children, and children it's so important to protect their safety, and yet who is there protecting him? So that's my thought. Thank you.
Sally. Hal, there's actually kind of a lighter moment in the film where Iona's saying, we made this decision, and Donnell says, I was the one who had to go and integrate. I was the one.
Yeah, I tried to really probe her about her decision to enroll him, and her whole family was against it. But in her words, the Supreme Court said he could go. The
10 years
president
earlier,
said he could
right?
go.
This is 10 years after.
Right. They all said he could go, and they were going to protect him.
We've got a call. Jeff on the West Side. Good morning, Jeff. Go ahead.
Good morning. Just a real quick comment. If he's looking for another material to make another documentary, you should check out the school that was on the property that is currently owned by Moose Haven down in Clay County. There was a school for blacks and in the early teens, 20s that got burned to the ground. And that whole story behind that one is fascinating. Just a thought.
Do you know what year that happened, Jeff?
I do not. But I used to do some surveying work, and we did some surveying there at Moose Haven, and I got some of the backstory on it at the time.
Interesting. Well,
Fascinating.
I see Tim Gilmore's interest has peaked, so you may yet see an installment on JaxPsychoGeo of that very story, but certainly no shortage of it. I want to just briefly talk about the screenings that these films are going to have. So tonight, there's a free screening at the University of North Florida. Excuse me, it's this afternoon, 1:45. Okay. So that's at the University of North Florida today. Tomorrow, there's a 7 p.m. screening at Sunray Cinema in Five Points. And tickets for that are $10 in advance. And then there's also a free but a waiting list only registration required screening at Murray Hill Library on Thursday, February 22nd at 4 p.m. And again, Hal, tell us that people can expect to see the principles of the film there.
Right. We'll have a talk back. Tim will be at some of these. I'll be there. Donald and Iona will be there. David Jameson will also be participating. And I should say that the film won't be available online for at least another year. We're going to be submitting it to film festivals and probably private groups. If they would like to have a screening, they could contact me.
Do you have any other film plans in the works that cover incidents in this area?
I don't, but I would love to talk to Tim about covering more of his stories.
You've done some previous work in this area, though.
Which is what?
I did a full-length documentary about a writer-activist, Lillian Smith, who had ties to North Florida and had brothers that lived in Jacksonville. And she lived here briefly as well. And she wrote about the psychosis of white supremacy, and doing her story about 4 or 5 years ago is sort of what has led me towards stories like this and doing more social justice stories like this.
Well, Tim Gilmore, Hal Jacobs, thank you so much for your work on this story and for bringing it to light. Excited that there's 3 screenings for people to check out. Is there a place if they just want to get more information about the film or the screenings that they can go to?
You can go to my website, hjacobscreative.com,
Terrific.
and find a link there.
All right.